You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. This week's episode is about a recent movie called The Founder, starring Michael Keaton. If you're interested in starting your own business and being an entrepreneur, or if you are running a business, you should definitely see this movie. And in this episode, I'm going to talk about the ideas in the movie The Founder. I'm not so much going to give a review of the movie as an artwork, as a piece of art. It's a decent movie. It's not a bad one. I don't think it's particularly amazing as far as a drama goes. But what I'm most interested in is the business ideas in this movie, because it does have some really interesting ideas for entrepreneurs to think about and learn from. It's not often that we get a decent movie about an entrepreneur and about business. Usually business is portrayed as something corrupt and bad in Hollywood movies. Often business people and entrepreneurs are villains who are generally ripping people off. But the main problem is just that the treatment of business is really superficial, and movies don't generally get made about business problems. And the interesting thing about The Founder is that it's all about the challenges facing entrepreneurs. So in this episode, I'm going to talk about some of the ideas that I thought were really interesting in this movie, The Founder, especially for people who want to be independent, to have their own business, and to be entrepreneurs. There's going to be spoilers. I don't think it matters particularly to talk about spoilers of this movie, but if that bothers you, then stop listening now and go and watch the movie first, because I'm just going to give an overview of the story. So this is the story of Ray Kroc and how he took MacDonald's from being a small burger joint in California to being a massive worldwide franchise business. So the movie starts in the late 50s. It's the period late 50s to early 60s when Ray Kroc first got involved in the McDonald's business. Kroc was a salesman selling milkshake machines, and he was in his early 50s and not doing really very well. And the movie shows him struggling trying to sell these milkshake machines when he gets a massive order from some restaurant in California, and he can't believe that they've ordered so many machines. So he goes to check them out, and it's this small place run by the McDonald's brothers, but selling them in a very different way, without all the silverware and plates and everything. You eat the burgers out of the bag, and they also have all sorts of innovative ways of streamlining their production process, which I'll talk about more in a minute. So Kroc finds this business to be so exciting that he's desperate to get involved, and he talks to the McDonald's brothers about starting a franchise, and they tell him that they've already tried this and it failed and they're not really interested. They refuse at first, and Kroc is incredibly persistent and really wants this to happen. He says this is his big opportunity, and the movie kind of alludes to the fact that he's had a lot of attempts at starting businesses that haven't really worked out in the past. And this one is his new big thing, but he manages to convince the brothers to go ahead with allowing him to set up a franchising business, which they have an ownership in. And the movie is about him doing that. He struggles a lot at first, encounters lots of different business problems, but he starts to make a real go of it. And there's a tension between what he wants to do to make this business work and what the McDonald's brothers want to do, which is essentially they don't want a lot of change. They're very conservative and resistant to change. And he wants to change a lot of things and really wants to push for rapid growth, which they're also very suspicious of. So there's a huge amount of tension between them. And eventually, Kroc offers to buy them out. And he basically says, name your price. And eventually he buys them out for $2.7 million. And in the end of the movie, Kroc has been successful in getting the McDonald's brothers out. And the movie suggests that he also kind of rips them off because they had a handshake deal for an ongoing share of profits. And Kroc also divorces his wife and marries a woman who he's been having an affair with and met during the course of his starting McDonald's. And the movie ends with McDonald's as this massive corporate giant, and the McDonald's brothers, who originally started their business, being kind of pushed out of the picture. So that's the story of the movie. Is the story true? From what I've read, it is more or less accurate, this movie. Some things about it are incredibly accurate. For example, the look and feel is all just absolutely perfect, late 50s, early 60s. And they had to make it perfect because they would have been sued by McDonald's if they misrepresented any of the restaurants or branding or historical look of McDonald's. So it all looks great and looks really authentic. I Googled a bit and found that some of the ideas in the movie are obviously put in for dramatic tension. Especially, I think what they wanted to do with this movie was to make this a story of Ray Kroc becoming kind of corrupted by his ambition to be big in business. Again, that's sort of typical for Hollywood. The sympathetic characters in the movie are the MacDonald brothers, who were small business people who started the business initially, and Kroc, who wanted to make this thing really big, is portrayed as being incredibly ruthless and vicious towards the end. And some of the things that they did to emphasize that apparently may not be true. For example, a big aspect of the plot is that Kroc rips off the original founders of McDonald's. He paid them $2.7 million, and in the movie there was this handshake deal for an ongoing share of profits into the future. And the movie says that because it was a handshake deal, the brothers weren't able to enforce it, and essentially implies that Kroc ripped them off. I found that a little suspicious when I saw it, because, you know, that's the kind of thing that you would not do a handshake deal over. The McDonald's brothers certainly weren't stupid, so I don't think that part of the movie is true. And from what I've read, the other thing is that the big story about Kroc buying out the McDonald's brothers was not that he ripped them off, but actually that when he asked them to name their price, they said $2.7 million, which in the early 60s was a vast sum. That was about $22 million in today's money. So the Kroc brothers got $22 million. And remember, they were the owners of a small hamburger business based around one restaurant, and they had tried franchising in a few nearby stores, but it was not a huge business. So $22 million doesn't sound like a ripoff to me. There are some other things in the movie that are not true. There's a whole subplot about how Ray Kroc's love interest wants to introduce a new, cheaper kind of milkshake, and this is something that the McDonald's brothers don't like. And apparently all of that is just totally untrue. That milkshake issue happened much later, after Kroc had already bought McDonald's. So that's all kind of made up for drama. Ray Kroc did write an autobiography called Grinding It Out, which I haven't read. I've been meaning to read it for years. I think it would be interesting, but apparently a lot of this movie was taken from that autobiography, but also from other sources. And a lot of this stuff is hard to tell what is really true or not. So I think there are some things that are made up that seem to be about generating more tension and giving more of a kind of dramatic corruption of Ray Kroc's character. And some of that, as I said, looks a little bit unreliable as to whether it's really true. But what I found fascinating about this movie is that it does talk about real business problems. And the characters in the movie are trying to solve real business problems. For example, one of the big problems for the expansion of McDonald's was taking what was an original store and making franchises, but making sure that you could ensure quality control. How do you do that? How do you stop your franchisees from damaging your brand by reducing quality? That's an interesting question that's tackled in this movie. The movie talks about how cash flow gets really tight as McDonald's is expanding. That is a typical problem for entrepreneurs. When you expand, things seem to be going really well because you're growing, but cash flow gets really tight. That's an interesting business problem. The movie also talks about the problem of how to reduce costs and how to make your business more efficient. And again, that is something that every business faces. And what I found very interesting in this movie was some of the business innovation that McDonald's showed that really shook the industry. And the first example they talk about is the original concept for McDonald's and how revolutionary it was. Because back when McDonald's started, fast food joints were still serving food on plates with silverware, and they still had large menus. You could get lots of different stuff. And McDonald's had this radical idea of cutting down the menu to just a few items, burgers, fries, drinks, and serving them with no silverware. You just eat it with your hands straight out of the bag. And in doing this, they were able to make themselves really efficient, but also really cheap. This is one of the lasting effects that McDonald's had on the industry, is they made food cheaper, which for working people is a massive benefit. One of the ways that they got costs down and became so efficient was in designing the kitchen entirely around the production flow of creating just these few items. And they show in the movie how the original McDonald's brothers did this by laying out a floor plan in chalk on a tennis court somewhere and paying people to mime the actions of frying and preparing burgers and then working out where the bottlenecks were in this production process and redesigning the kitchen entirely around removing those bottlenecks so that they could produce the food incredibly quickly. I thought that was fascinating to see that in the movie. And another fascinating thing that they show in the movie is business model innovation. So one of the things that Ray Kroc does, and this is actually advised by somebody else, another character who was a real person in real life who advised him, what they did was they worked out that the business model for the McDonald's franchise was to own the land that franchisees would run their businesses on. So that really McDonald's became a property business based around ownership of the land that the restaurants are on, that was then leased back to the franchisees. The really interesting business question that this movie tackles is, how do you scale a business? How do you take something that works really well, like this McDonald's burger joint that is very efficient, and how do you turn that one place into a national franchise? Because the MacDonald brothers had made this amazing product. They'd simplified the menu. They'd done away with the cutlery and everything else. They had a massively efficient kitchen, and they had a really cheap price, and they created this reliable, family-friendly product. But they couldn't scale their business. They'd done a little bit of franchising, and it had failed because they just couldn't get the quality control right. And this is where Ray Kroc was very interesting, because what he did was to solve this problem in two different ways. Firstly, he changed the focus of the business onto finding the right people to become franchisees. So he created this whole McDonald's University, and he actually changed the kind of people that he was looking for to become franchisees and became really good at vetting the people who were going to be franchisees. And he basically found incredibly hardworking, dedicated people who would be good franchisees and wouldn't harm the brand by reducing quality. So he switched, and the movie shows how originally he was looking for guys with money who'd be interested in becoming franchisees. But actually, in the end, he realized that what he really wanted was people who are just willing to absolutely work, who would be better entrepreneurs. And then the second thing that Kroc did was, advised by this accountant, business partner of his, when he realized that the business model was owning the land that the restaurants are built on, what he was able to do was to use that to ensure quality control. And this is mentioned just briefly in the movie, but essentially, if you own the land that a franchisee is running their business on, then part of that contract for their lease can be that they have to ensure quality control, otherwise they get booted out. So the movie really shows how Kroc solved this problem of how to scale the business without losing quality. I think one of the most fascinating things that I found in this movie that could be interesting for you too is that it also shows how very different the personalities of the people who founded the business, the McDonald's brothers, were, and Ray Kroc, who's the guy who successfully scaled the business. And I think this is something that is really important for entrepreneurs, that very different skills and attitudes are required for different stages in the life of your business. And it's not necessarily the same person that has the skills to do the things necessary to take the business to the next level of growth. That's not to say that you have to always be thinking of continually scaling up a business. But if you do want to grow a business in that way, it takes different skills and different attitudes. And this movie really brings that out very well, because the McDonald's brothers were very conscientious restaurant owners who revolutionized the concept of a burger restaurant. And they were incredibly innovative in doing that in a way that Ray Kroc simply wasn't. He didn't come up with the idea of the speedy system for the kitchen at McDonald's. He didn't come up with the idea of slashing the menu down to just a couple of items and of getting rid of all the cutlery and of making everything so streamlined. He just saw that that was a genius idea. But the interesting thing is that the McDonald's brothers were not good at franchising. They never solved the problem of how to find good franchisees and how to scale the business without compromising the quality. So Kroc was useless at starting a business and getting the initial concept going, but he was brilliant at scaling it. And the McDonald's brothers were brilliant at having started this business and creating a really innovative concept, but they weren't any good at scaling it. And this is often the case with founders. It's not always clear that every founder can make the transition from the initial starting point of a business to really growing it and scaling it. And that's one of the reasons why venture capitalists, when they get involved in a company, there's always a question about whether or not the founders are going to remain in management positions and how. And part of that is to do with venture capitalists' own interests and their own agendas, but part of it is to do with the fact that they understand that often founders can't make that transition. So I think it's definitely worthwhile, if you're in business, thinking about some of these questions. What kind of challenges would you face if you were to change your business from the size that it currently is to 10 times that size? What would it change about your role within the company? What would you have to do differently? What are all the things that you would no longer be able to touch because you just wouldn't have any time? And how would you delegate those tasks to other people? Who would those people be? These are really interesting questions for anyone who's got their own business and is wanting to scale it. So I definitely recommend checking out the movie The Founder if you're interested in business. It's great to see a film that actually tackles a fascinating entrepreneurial story, an amazing business, MacDonald, and talks about real challenges faced by entrepreneurs. If you are interested in becoming an entrepreneur, you should definitely check out my book, Becoming an Entrepreneur, which is all about all of the key principles that I found helpful in entrepreneurship. And you can find it on Amazon under my name, Jake Desyllas. I hope you found that interesting. I'd love to know what you think, and I'll be back soon with another episode.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you have feedback about the show, please email jake@thevoluntarylife.com. If you enjoyed this program, please share the podcast with your friends or click the donate button on thevoluntarylife.com.